Danger might be closer than you think. Before we begin, like this video, comment where and what time you're watching from, and subscribe for more chilling stories. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into the unknown. This happened in the fall of 2022, during a cross-country road trip I took with my girlfriend at the time, Megan. We'd both been working remote, and decided to take advantage of it by hitting the road for a few weeks. No fixed plan, just national parks, coffee shops with good Wi-Fi, and a list of weird roadside attractions to check out along the way. That night we were somewhere in the middle of Nevada, hours from any real town. It was one of those stretches of highway where the radio cuts out and the GPS gets glitchy. We'd spent the day hiking at Great Basin and stayed too long, so we ended up driving into the night with nowhere booked. Eventually we just pulled off onto a dirt access road to sleep in the car until morning. We'd done this a few times before. Fold down the back seats, lay out the sleeping bags, crack the windows slightly. Nothing new. It wasn't the most comfortable sleep, but it beat paying for a motel just to crash for a few hours. The road we chose didn't lead anywhere obvious, just kind of veered off the highway and faded into open desert. We parked near a clump of low shrubs, far enough off the road that we wouldn't be seen from passing cars. It was pitch dark out, no moon, no traffic, no cell signal, but at the time it felt kind of peaceful, like we were tucked away in our own little pocket of the world. I remember drifting off around 11:30, Megan already asleep next to me, curled up in the sleeping bag with her hoodie pulled over her face. I was dozing in and out, still half alert like I always am when sleeping in strange places. Then I heard it, a soft tap on the passenger side window, just one, light but intentional. It snapped me awake instantly. I didn't move. My heart was pounding and my mind went straight to animal. Maybe a branch, maybe wind. But there were no trees, no wind, just still, dead desert air. Then, maybe 15 seconds later, another tap, this time louder. Not a scratch, not something brushing, someone tapping with their fingertip. I slowly lifted my head just enough to peek over the back seat, trying not to rustle the sleeping bag. The windows were fogged up from our breath, but I could make out a shape outside, a shadow standing still just beyond the glass. Not moving, not shifting, just there. I didn't breathe. I reached out slowly and touched Megan's arm. She stirred, confused, whispering, "What?" I didn't answer right away. I just mouthed, "Someone's outside." Her eyes widened instantly. That's when we both heard it, a deep breath right next to the glass. Then, as if it had been waiting for us to react, a third tap, slower, fingernail against the window. I've never felt that level of stillness in my body before, like even my heartbeat was trying to shrink down and disappear. Megan sat up slowly beside me, eyes locked on the fogged window, her hand clutching my wrist so tight I could feel her nails digging in. I tried to rationalize what we were seeing. Maybe a hiker who got lost, maybe someone looking for help. But that didn't make sense. We were at least 10 miles from the last town and it was past midnight. And this person wasn't knocking, wasn't calling out, just standing there, tapping, breathing, watching. I reached into the front seat, grabbing the flashlight we kept in the glove compartment. I didn't turn it on right away. I didn't want to make a move until I was sure. Then, just as I was about to speak up, the shape outside stepped back, slowly, like it realized we were fully awake now and it had made its point. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the window, but there was no one there, just an empty patch of dirt and brush. I opened the door slightly, stepped out with the light, sweeping it across the area around the car. Nothing, not even footprints in the dusty ground. Megan got out too, against my better judgment. She wanted to see it for herself. I kept the light moving, checking behind the shrubs, up and down the narrow dirt road. There was no sound, no movement, just an endless stretch of dark desert. Then Megan froze and grabbed my arm. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the back window of the car. There, smeared in the condensation, was a greasy handprint. Long fingers, almost too long, dragged down the glass as if someone had leaned in and watched us sleep. We stared at it for a long time. The way it was angled, the height. It had to have been someone tall, standing right up against the glass, face almost touching. We didn't speak. We just got in the front seats, locked every door, and sat there with the headlights off, listening. The engine stayed off. We didn't want the noise. We were too afraid to draw attention again. Too afraid we already had. Megan kept glancing at the rearview mirror while I gripped the steering wheel, heart pounding. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, just when we started convincing ourselves it was over, something moved in the distance, just beyond the edge of the high beams, maybe 30, 40 feet out. Or figure barely visible, walking slowly across the road from one side of the desert to the other. Not running, not trying to hide, just walking, like it knew we were watching. The way that figure moved, it was off. Not in a supernatural way, not twitchy or crawling like in movies. It was just too smooth, too casual, like it wasn't worried about being seen, like it had all the time in the world. We stayed frozen in the car, headlights off again, not blinking, barely breathing, and then it stopped, right at the edge of the brush on the other side of the road. I flicked the flashlight in that direction, but the second the beam hit that area, it was empty. I don't mean the figure ran or ducked. It just wasn't there anymore. Nothing to chase, no sound of footsteps, just gone. We didn't wait any longer. I turned the engine on and peeled back onto the highway, not caring about speed limits or the rattling sound our car made from all the dust. We drove for 2 hours straight until we saw lights, real lights, from a gas station just outside Ely. We pulled in, parked under the brightest floodlight we could find, and just sat there. I think we stayed for almost an hour without saying much. Neither of us wanted to sleep again. Neither of us wanted to check the back seat either. At one point, Megan went to use the bathroom, and when she came back, she said something that still sticks with me. What if it wasn't the first time they've done this? We ended the trip a week early. Said we were tired, burned out, wanted to get back to normal life, but the truth is neither of us wanted to sleep in the car again. We checked the footage from our dash cam later, hoping, maybe dreading, that it had caught something, but it glitched during that night. A full 2-hour window where the video just stops recording. When it picks up again, it's us speeding down the highway, breathless and pale in the early hours of the morning. That's the part that really got to me. Something was there, and whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. We've never talked much about it since. Megan and I broke up a few months after that trip. Nothing dramatic, just drifted. But every once in a while, I'll wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I heard a tap. Not a bang, not a knock, just a soft, patient tap on the window. And every single time I check to make sure all the doors are locked, and I don't look outside. Story 2. This happened in the summer of 2018. I was 22, fresh out of college, and that was the year I said yes to everything. I had no job lined up, barely any savings and no real plan, just this restless energy that made me want to go. So when my old roommates Greg and Mia suggested a week-long camping trip through southern Oregon and northern California, I jumped on it. We weren't seasoned hikers or anything, just 3 broke kids with borrowed gear and a borrowed car, looking to disconnect and maybe feel like we were doing something wild. Our route was loose, nothing fully mapped out, just a few pins on Google Maps and the idea of finding cool spots. By the 4th day, we were running low on food and had to stop in this tiny gas station just outside a town called McLeod. I remember it because it felt like stepping into a different decade. One of those single pump stations with flickering fluorescent lights, shelves half-stocked with expired candy bars and dusty road maps. There was one guy working the counter, late 50s maybe, weathered skin, red trucker hat, and this look in his eyes like he'd seen some things and didn't sleep much anymore. We asked if there were any good campgrounds nearby, and he pointed us toward a wooded area about 20 minutes up the road. Then he paused, leaned on the counter, looked at us one by one and said, "You sure you want to go there?" We laughed awkwardly, thought he was just messing with us, but he didn't smile. He looked right at Mia and said, "People go up there sometimes, don't always come back." We all kind of froze. Greg, being Greg, tried to break the tension with some joke about bears or backwoods murderers. The guy didn't flinch. He just said, "I'd pick somewhere else if I were you." That should have been our sign. But when we got back to the car, we started talking ourselves out of it. He's just trying to scare us, probably some local thing, urban legends, whatever. We were young and stupid, and that kind of warning only made the place sound cooler. So we went. The turnoff was barely marked, just A thin dirt road cutting through dense pine forest. No signs, no official campground indicators. But when we pulled in, we saw fire rings made of stone and a couple of old logs arranged like benches. So clearly other people had stayed there. It was secluded, sure, but honestly kind of beautiful. Quiet except for the wind brushing through the branches. We set up camp, made some food, and drank cheap boxed wine until the stars came out. None of us mentioned the gas station guy again. Not out loud, but I could feel it in the way we kept glancing over our shoulders, or how we placed our sleeping bags closer together than usual. Around midnight, the fire started dying out, and the cold crept in fast. We were all a little buzzed, and Mia had started dozing off next to the fire pit while Greg and I were still quietly talking. I remember we were mid-conversation when the forest went. Still, I know that sounds like something people say in stories to be dramatic, but I mean it. Everything stopped. No crickets, no wind, not even the occasional snap of a branch. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the entire forest. Greg noticed it too. He stopped mid-sentence and looked around. I asked, "Do you hear that?" And he said, "Exactly, I don't hear anything." Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard a single crack, like a heavy stick snapping underfoot. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. And it wasn't random. It had rhythm, like someone walking. One step, pause, another step. But whoever it was didn't speak, didn't call out, didn't use a flashlight. Just that slow, methodical crunching through the brush. Greg stood up and aimed his headlamp in the direction of the sound, but the beam barely cut through the dense trees. Nothing moved. Nothing replied. Mia sat up, groggy, asking what was going on, and I told her quietly, "I think someone's out there." We waited. The footsteps stopped. Then, nothing again. That same deafening silence returned, but this time it felt heavier, more intentional. We decided to turn off the lanterns and huddle in the tent for the rest of the night. No one slept. We stayed zipped up in our bags, all three of us lying there listening to every leaf, every creak. At one point, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., we heard the faintest shuffle of gravel, like footsteps right outside the tent. Not walking, just shifting weight, standing still. Greg whispered my name so quietly it barely registered, and all I could do was nod in the dark. We didn't unzip the tent. We didn't speak. We didn't even breathe heavy. Just stayed there, paralyzed, until the sky began to lighten, and the birds finally started chirping again. When we crawled out, the first thing we noticed was that the fire pit had been disturbed. Not destroyed, just shifted. Some of the rocks had been moved, and directly in the middle where there'd been ash and blackened wood, someone, or something, had placed 3 pine cones in a perfect triangle. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't animals. It was arranged, deliberate, and none of us had done it. We packed up in record time. No breakfast, no stretching, no sitting around to take in the morning. Just yanked stakes from the ground, tossed everything into the trunk, and got the hell out. None of us spoke until we hit the paved road again, and even then it was just Greg saying, "That wasn't a bear." Mia stayed silent for almost the entire drive back into town. She just stared out the window like she was still expecting to see someone step out from the trees and wave us back. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that same triangle of pine cones just following us somehow. It felt like we weren't supposed to be there, and whatever was out there made sure we knew it. We ended up stopping back at that same gas station, mostly to use the bathroom and buy coffee, but also, I think, to feel some kind of closure. The same guy was working. When we walked in, he looked at us like he recognized us instantly. He didn't smile, didn't say anything at first, just nodded once like you saw it too. I asked, "Has that happened before?" And he just said, "More than you'd think." I asked if anyone had ever gotten hurt, and he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Only the ones who stayed 2 nights. We got in the car and drove straight home after that. No more camping, no more side trails, and we never brought it up again, not even to each other. It's like once we left that place, we didn't want to give it any more power by saying it out loud, but I still think about it. Those slow, careful footsteps, the pine cones, the silence that didn't feel natural, and especially that clerk's final words. They come back to me sometimes when I'm lying in bed, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering, What if we had stayed one more night? Story 3. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've been backpacking alone since I was 19. Did the PCT solo, slept through lightning, storms in Wyoming, even had a bear brush against my tent once in Idaho. But what happened in September of last year shook me up in a way I still can't fully explain. I'm 34 now, live in Washington, and I usually take a solo weekend trip every few months to decompress. I bring a compact trail cam to capture wildlife footage, mostly deer, the occasional fox. Just a little hobby to help me feel more connected to the places I go. I've never caught anything truly strange on it, until that night. I'd driven out to a remote part of Olympic National Forest. Nothing too treacherous, just a few miles off a service road. There's a ridge I like that overlooks a valley, with just enough tree cover to feel protected but still open enough for stargazing. I set up my tent by late afternoon, got a small fire going, ate one of those sad boil-in-a-bag meals, and set up the trail cam on a tree maybe 10 yards out, aimed back at the camp. I always like reviewing the footage in the morning while I eat. Breakfast. It's become kind of a ritual. That night, everything felt normal, peaceful. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the pines, and I fell asleep to that comforting, total silence you only get miles from civilization. At around 2:30 a.m., I woke up briefly, just that groggy, half-asleep stir you get when you're adjusting in your sleeping bag. I didn't hear anything weird. No footsteps, no animals, no reason to be alarmed. I shifted, zipped the bag higher, and drifted off again. Nothing felt off. No dreams, no cold sweats, just sleep. When I got up around 7, I went through my normal routine. Boil water, instant coffee, oatmeal, and pop the SD card out of the trail cam. I was scrolling through the night clips on my phone, half-focused, expecting to see maybe a raccoon nosing around my food bag. The first few clips were just that. Wind, shadows, trees, normal stuff. Then one video, time-stamped 3:41 a.m., hit me like a punch to the chest. The camera had picked up movement. At first, it was just the glow of my tent from inside. I could see the shape of my body curled up still. Then, about 6 seconds in, something stepped into the frame. A person, alone, standing just outside the edge of the light. No backpack, no gear, just a tall, narrow figure in dark clothing. They were facing the tent. My tent, not moving, not walking past, just watching. I froze. My spoon dropped into the oatmeal and splashed hot water on my hand, but I didn't feel it. I kept staring at the screen, trying to process what I was looking at. This wasn't a hiker, this wasn't a ranger. It was someone, in the middle of the night, watching me sleep. I watched that clip over and over, hoping maybe I'd see them walk away at the end. But they didn't. The video just ended with them still standing there, head tilted slightly like they were listening for something. There was no follow-up clip, no motion trigger after that. Whatever they did next, they either left without triggering the sensor, or they got too close. I checked the camera again, physically walked over to it, scanned the ground. No footprints, no broken twigs, but the lens had a faint smudge on it, like someone brushed it with their sleeve or hand. That's when the weight of it hit me. I'd been asleep, totally unaware, with someone standing just feet away in complete silence. The worst part? I hadn't locked the zipper. Usually I do. Just a habit from bare safety and, honestly, paranoia. But that night, I'd been more lazy. The flap had just been loosely pulled shut, and the idea that someone could have unzipped it without me waking up made my stomach turn. I started packing immediately. I didn't eat, didn't even finish my coffee. I just tore everything down and stuffed it into my pack. I kept glancing at the tree line as I worked, convinced I'd see someone watching again. But there was nothing, just stillness. That same heavy, almost too quiet air I hadn't noticed the night before. The hike back to my car felt 10 times longer than the hike in. Every sound made me flinch. Squirrels rustling, birds flapping, twigs snapping under my own boots. I jumped at all of it. My brain was stuck on that image from the video, replaying the angle of the head, the way the figure leaned slightly forward like they were thinking about taking a step closer. And something else started nagging at me. The person, they didn't have a flashlight. No headlamp, no phone screen, but the camera caught them clearly. That meant They were standing in total darkness, just waiting, completely still in a forest with uneven ground, brush, holes, like they knew the place by heart. When I reached the trailhead and saw my car untouched, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost laughed. But as I was tossing my pack into the trunk, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. On the back window, near the edge of the dust-covered glass, someone had drawn a small circle with their finger. Just a single, perfect circle. Nothing else. It hadn't been there when I left. I know that for a fact because I cleaned the windows before the trip. That simple, quiet marking was enough to make me feel like I'd escaped something I didn't fully understand. Like whoever had stood outside my tent had also followed me and decided to leave a message. I drove straight home, barely stopping. That night, I didn't unpack. I didn't even shower. I just locked every door and window, drew the blinds, and sat on the couch with all the lights on, trail cam SD card still in my pocket. I watched that clip again. Must have been 20 times that night. I tried to convince myself it was some drifter, a hiker who got lost, or maybe some backwoods weirdo who thought he was being funny. But the more I watched it, the more I noticed little details. The way the figure kept their arms close to their body, the stillness in their stance, like they weren't unsure of what they were doing, like they belonged there more than I did. A few days later, I posted a still frame from the video in a local hiking group. Nothing dramatic, just asking if anyone had seen something similar, or maybe recognized the person. I kept it vague on purpose. One guy replied with a private message almost immediately. He said, "That ridge is weird. I camped there last year. Didn't see anyone, but my tent was unzipped when I woke up and my boots were facing the wrong way." That message rattled me more than I expected. It was such a small thing, but too similar to be coincidence. I asked where exactly he'd set up his tent, and it was almost the same spot I'd used. Exact tree line, same overlook. Since then, I haven't gone solo camping again. I still hike, still love the woods, but something changed in me after that trip. I keep the trail cam in a drawer now. I haven't used it since. Not because I'm scared of what I'll find, but because I already found it. That image, that silent figure just outside my tent, has burned itself into my memory in a way no bear, no storm, no close call ever has. Sometimes I think about how quiet that night was, how close they were, how easy it would have been to unzip the flap, step inside, and anyway, if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, sleeping under the stars, and you get that feeling that something's watching you, don't ignore it. Don't chalk it up to nerves, because some people don't make noise. Some people don't need to. And if you've got a trail cam pointed back at your tent, check it carefully in the morning. Story 4 had eased up just enough that people felt safe going out again. I was 29 at the time, living in Central Oregon, and a couple of friends and I, Max and Danny, decided to spend a weekend camping in the Deschutes National Forest. Nothing fancy, just the three of us, some basic gear, and a quiet spot off the beaten path. We weren't deep into survivalist stuff, just casual campers looking to unwind and get away from screens for a few days. Max had picked the location, this small clearing he'd found a year before while mountain biking. Said it had a fire ring already built, a stream nearby, and no one around for miles. It sounded perfect. We arrived late Friday afternoon and set up camp while there was still a little light. The trees there were tall and tight, the kind that seemed to trap shadows even in daylight. Still, the place felt peaceful, quiet, in a way you only get far from towns and cars. We set up our tents, built a fire, and made dinner. Around 9 p.m., we were sitting around the flames, swapping stories and sipping whiskey from a shared flask when the wind started to pick up. Nothing crazy, just enough to make the trees sway and add a little atmosphere. I remember thinking how nice it felt to finally disconnect, to not be checking my phone, not thinking about work, just surrounded by friends and the sound of wind moving through the forest. Around 11, the fire started dying down, and Max suggested we grab more wood before bed. We split up. Danny and I headed one way with flashlights, and Max went off in the other direction. We weren't far apart, maybe 30 yards between us at most, but the darkness made everything feel more distant. Our flashlights weren't great. those cheap plastic ones you buy at gas stations, and they started flickering every so often. Danny joked about it, said we were probably going to get murdered by some backwoods cryptid, and we both laughed. But the second she said that, I caught something move. Just for a split second. At the edge of my light's beam behind a thick tree trunk, something ducked. I stopped walking. Danny kept going for a few steps before realizing I wasn't beside her anymore. I didn't say anything at first. I was trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. A deer, maybe. But something about the movement didn't feel natural. It was fast, yes, but also low. Human height, not animal. And the way it moved behind the tree, it wasn't startled. It was intentional, like it didn't want to be seen. I slowly aimed my flashlight back toward the spot, and of course it flickered again. When it steadied, there was nothing there, just trees. But the feeling in my gut was immediate. We were not alone out there. Danny walked back toward me, sensing something was off. "What is it?" she whispered. I hesitated, then told her I thought I saw someone. Not an animal, someone. She looked around quickly, her flashlight darting through the trees, but the beams just landed on bark. Leaves. Empty space. Maybe it was Max messing with us, she offered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Max isn't that type. He's practical, level-headed, the kind of guy who brings 2 knives just in case and reminds everyone to hang their food up properly. If he'd wanted to scare us, it wouldn't have been this subtle. And besides, Max had gone the other way. This figure was between us and camp. We decided to head back to the fire. Every few steps, I'd turn and shine my flashlight behind us. And every single time I half expected to see someone standing there. When we got back to the clearing, Max was already there, arms crossed, looking uneasy. Before we could say anything, he asked, "Were you guys messing with me?" We looked at each other. "No," Danny said. "Why?" Max pointed toward the tree line behind him. "I thought I heard you two whispering, like, really close." His voice wasn't accusatory. He sounded unsettled, like he didn't want to believe what he'd heard. None of us spoke. For a moment. That's when we all heard it. Movement. Not loud, but clear. Leaves crunching under deliberate steps just beyond the tree line behind our tents. The kind of sound you only make when you're trying not to make sound. All 3 of us turned, flashlights up. I swear I caught a shape between the trunks briefly, before my light blinked out again. Max's held steady, and he walked a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, aiming the beam directly where the sound had come from. Nothing. But again, that feeling, like the woods weren't empty, like we were being watched by something patient, not rushing, just waiting. We backed closer to the fire, instinctively. We didn't say it, but none of us wanted to go into the tents. Not after what we'd seen, or thought we'd seen. Instead, we built the fire back up, sat close, and tried to act normal. Max eventually said, "We leave first thing in the morning." We agreed. Around 3 a.m., Danny finally said she couldn't stay up anymore and went to her tent. Max and I sat there another hour or so before calling it 2. Just before I unzipped my tent, I did one last sweep of the woods with my flashlight. The beam flickered again, twice, and in that brief flash between shadows, I swear I saw eyes, not animal, too high off the ground, not reflecting, just watching. I barely slept. Every noise outside sent my heart racing. Every gust of wind brushing the side of the tent made me grip the handle of the knife I kept tucked near my sleeping bag. I kept thinking about those eyes. The way they didn't glow, didn't blink, just existed. At some point I must have drifted off out of sheer exhaustion, because the next thing I remember is sunlight pouring through the tent fabric and the sound of Max unzipping his. We didn't waste a second. We packed fast, barely spoke, and didn't bother eating. The fire pit was still warm when we left it. We didn't even look back as we pushed through the trees toward the trail. The strange thing? Nothing was disturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anyone or anything had been near us. But the tension in our bodies told a different story. Our instincts had flared for a reason, and none of us doubted what we'd felt that night. When we got to the car, we loaded our gear in silence, but before we got in, Max pointed out something on the rear windshield. A smear. Not a handprint exactly, but a shape. smudged and long like someone had run a finger along the glass in a curve. "That wasn't there before," he said. And it wasn't. I'd cleaned the windows that morning before we left town. Back home, Danny refused to talk about it. She shut down every time we brought it up. Max and I went over the details once or twice, trying to make sense of it, but we always circled back to the same thought. Whatever was out there didn't want to scare us off. It didn't make noise. It didn't attack. It just let us know it was there, quietly, strategically, like it had done this before. I still don't know if it was a person, something feral, or something else entirely, but it watched us for hours. It stood behind those trees, and it moved when the lights flickered. I haven't gone back to Deschutes since. I've camped elsewhere, even solo, but I bring stronger flashlights now, ones I check twice, and I never ignore that feeling anymore, that electric sense that you're not alone. Because sometimes, when the lights dim and the fire dies, the forest doesn't sleep. Sometimes, it waits. Story. Why this happened in early spring of 2021, during a weekend camping trip with my cousin Dave and his girlfriend Sarah. I was 30 at the time, working a desk job in Seattle, burnt out and desperate for fresh air. Dave was the outdoorsy one. He grew up hunting and fishing, always knew how to find those quiet, scenic spots that never showed up on official maps. That weekend, he took us to a place near Lake Wenatchee, a few miles off the main trails, tucked between tall pines and sloping ridges. It was a place he swore by, said he'd camped there a dozen times without issue. Isolated, peaceful, full of bird song and silence. We hiked in on a Saturday morning, found a perfect spot by a slow-moving creek, and set up camp before noon. The weather was cold but dry, and the sun filtered through the trees in that soft, hazy way that makes everything feel dreamlike. We spent most of the day hiking and lounging around the fire. Everything felt normal, good even, like we'd stepped out of time for a while. Sarah brought a little Bluetooth speaker and played some classic rock while we cooked dinner. There were no signs of anyone else around. No tire tracks, no distant chatter, not even the sound of a plane overhead. Just us and the woods. That night, after the fire died down, we sat for a while in the quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels earned. You don't realize how much noise you live with until it's gone. We turned in around 11 p.m., each of us crawling into our tents. Mine was set, a little apart from theirs, maybe 10 or 15 feet, just enough for a bit of space. I remember zipping up, cocooning into my bag and thinking, this is exactly what I needed. I must have been asleep for about 2 hours when I woke up. No dreams, just that sudden something's not right kind of awakening. It was cold and still and dead quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels wrong. Then I heard it, a scream, a woman's scream, distant at first but clear, high-pitched, drawn out, raw with panic. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, far enough that it was muffled, but close enough that I knew it was real. My first thought was Sarah, but I could hear soft movement in their tent, like she and Dave had woken up too. Then the scream came again, louder this time, longer. Help me, that's what it sounded like. I unzipped my tent and sat up, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark. I could hear Sarah whispering, "What the hell was that?" And Dave, sounding more serious than I'd ever heard him, said, "Get back in the tent, don't go out there." I didn't get back in my tent. I stayed halfway out, crouched low with the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The beam caught nothing but trees, solid dark trunks and branches that seemed to crowd closer the longer I looked. Dave whispered again, more forceful this time, "Don't answer it." That's when it hit me. He wasn't just being cautious. He was afraid. Not in the "there's a bear" kind of way, but in that deep old instinct kind of way. I could hear his zipper start to close as he pulled Sarah back down into the tent, but I couldn't stop listening. Another scream cut through the woods, closer now, and this time it wasn't clear if it was saying help or just making a sound for the sake of being heard. There's something horrifying about hearing a voice out of place in nature, a human voice where there should be none. The scream came again, then stopped suddenly, mid-sound, like someone had cut it off. No footsteps, no rustling, just the silence swallowing it whole. I scanned the trees with the flashlight, heart pounding so loud it felt like it echoed, Then I heard a new sound, even worse than the scream. Humming. Soft. Inconsistent. Like someone trying to remember the melody of a lullaby they hadn't sung in years. It was coming from the left side of the camp, just beyond the line of sight of the fire pit. I clicked off the flashlight instantly and crouched lower. I didn't want whatever it was to see the light. For at least 20 minutes I stayed frozen like that, barely breathing. The humming would fade, then start again, from a different spot. It moved around us in a slow, wide circle. Dave hadn't said another word, and I imagined he was doing the same, trying to calculate whether this was someone playing a sick prank or something worse. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The woods went back to that empty stillness, like nothing had ever happened. No footsteps walking away, no fading of the voice, just gone. I slowly crawled back into my tent and lay there with my knife clutched against my chest, eyes wide open, staring at the roof of the tent until the sky started to turn gray. The next morning, none of us said much. We packed in silence. It was only when we were hiking out that Dave finally said, "It happens out here sometimes." I stopped in my tracks. "You knew?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. First time I heard it, I was alone. I made the mistake of calling back. That sentence hit harder than I expected. He never explained what happened after he did. I didn't ask. Sarah looked shaken the entire hike out, and to this day she refuses to go camping again. I don't blame her, because here's the thing. I don't know what we heard that night. I just know it wasn't human, at least not anymore.